and Pals. And Pals 1619 for April 1693 was an alleged Danish witch. She was the last woman to be legally executed for sorcery in Denmark. Background: in 1692, the cunning woman Karen Gregers Madsens from Lomelev was accused of poisoning. She was hired by Ingeborg Olofsdatter in Nykøbing Falster to drug and murder her abusive and violent husband, Oswald Egger. Karen suggested that Egger was to be fed a bone from a corpse at the cemetery, so as the dead was to come after and kill him. The lover of Ingeborg, Ole Bosen, acquired the bone, but it did not work, and Egger was instead murdered with poison. After having been interrogated by 6 priests, she confessed to practicing magic and pointed out Anne Cruz, Abigail Nielstatter, and Anne Pals in Tatterup as witches, as well as 96 clients. Accusations: Anne Pals was put on trial in 1692 accused of having enchanted a bailiff Morten Fax by use of magic. The bailiff had taken over a property in Overup previously owned by Pals and her husband Petter. Before she had left the farm, she was to have peed bad luck into it. This had caused the Faxes to feel uncomfortable in the house. Karen claimed to have seen her do this. The property had been a very good one, and had inherited it from her first husband, Niels, and it was thought that her second husband had married her because of the property after they lost it. The marriage had become unhappy. She was also accused of having murdered a woman by use of magic after her husband had fallen in love with her. In 1691, her husband had danced and flirted with Maren Jacobsdatter, and had promised Maren an accident, so that she would no longer be able to dance with other people's spouses and be admired such. Shortly thereafter, Maren had become sick, and eventually she had died. Thirdly, she was accused of having spoiled the harvest for a man, Hans Sverk, who was guilty of having forced her son to join the army. Interrogation: Anne Pals was imprisoned on Nykøbing Slot 31 August 1692. A group of priests began to interrogate her even before the trial had officially begun. When the trial opened 27 September 1692, she confessed the following: yes, she was a witch. She had met Satan in the shape of a black cat by the name Puss, who called her Annie's, and she had given her body and soul to him. She was unsure whether this had happened 6 years ago or 50 years ago, when she had been married to her first husband for 4 years. Her familiar helped her on the farm in the shape of a horse or a sheep, and Stan did his part, and was fed with oatmeal. She had also been at the witches' Sabbath on Hesnes with the other accused women. Hans Stang from Hassilo played the drum while Abigail Nielstatter, by Stan called Beejel, danced in the middle. Abigail was also able to travel on a staff to Trondheim in Norway. Sentence: on 2 November 1692, the court, led by Judge Morten Fax, judged her guilty and sentenced her to death. When the matter was to be confirmed by the higher court, Pals withdrew her confession. She said she had only confessed because the priests had tortured her in prison. She had been afraid to withdraw her confession before, because the priest had threatened that if she did so she would have her tongue ripped out and be burned alive. A majority of the High Court in Copenhagen, however, of the other women accused, and Cruz was given the same sentence, but she died in prison before the execution. Abigail Nielstatter was freed from execution but exiled for her bad name, and Karen from Lomelev was flogged and banished. Execution: normally, the method of execution for people sentenced for sorcery in Denmark was to be burned alive, but Pals was spared from the normal punishment by a special permission from the king, who ordered that she was to be decapitated before she was burned. On 4 April 1693, Karen was flogged. The The corpse of Anne Cruz was burnt, and Anne Pals was decapitated and her body thrown on the stake. On the place of execution, a placet was to be put on a pike with a description of the crime. Aftermath. Anne Pals was the last woman to be legally executed for sorcery in Denmark, but her case was not the last Danish witch trial. The last large witch trial in Denmark was the Fisted Witch Trial of 1698, in which several women were sentenced to death accused of having caused fits by sorcery. After the fits were proved to be false, however, the condemned were freed. After that, the Danish authorities were reluctant to accept any more charges of witchcraft. When the local court of Schellenberg condemned 2 women to be burned at the stake for witchcraft in 1708, the sentence was revoked by the High Court. Anne Pals has been called the last witch to be executed in Denmark. She was also likely the last woman to be executed for sorcery in Denmark, however. The very last person to be legally executed for sorcery in Denmark was in fact a man, the Grenadier Johan Pistorius. There were death sentences for witchcraft in Denmark long after this. In 1733 a student, and in 1752 a farmer, were sentenced to life imprisonment with forced labor for satanic pact, and as late as in 1803 2 craftsmen received death sentences for the same crime, although none of the sentences were actually carried out. People were also lynched for witchcraft in Denmark long after the formal persecution stopped, the best-known cases being that of Dorte Genstatter, who was apprehended by villagers who tied her up in her own home and burned it down after having accused her of causing death by magic, and the last lynching for witchcraft, in which Anna Clemens was lynched after having been pointed out for sorcery by a cunning woman in Brigstad at Horsens in 1800.